Hey, we're going to talk about the characters in To Kill a Mockingbird because several people have asked, who is this, who is that? And so rather than answer those individually, we're going to just go through most of the major characters in To Kill a Mockingbird. So we're going to start with the Finch family, right? This is headed up by Atticus, who's the father, Atticus Finch. The wife is not in the picture. She died when the kids were very young. Old enough for the older brother Jem to remember her, but for the younger sister Scout, she doesn't quite really remember except vague impressions of who her mother is. So Atticus is the father. He has two children, Jeremy Atticus Finch, who's known as Jem. He's the older brother. When the story opens, he's probably, maybe 10 years old. You then have his younger sister, Jean Louise Finch, who is nicknamed Scout. Scout is the narrator of the story, and so it's her voice that we hear throughout the novel. And she's also kind of a tomboy, and she's probably 6 years old when the actual book starts. So outside of that immediate family, Atticus has a younger brother who's a doctor named Jack. Of course, he's Uncle Jack to the kids. And then he has a sister who's older named Aunt Alexandria. She lives at a place called Finch Landing, which is a little bit outside of town. And she has a husband who's not really much of a character, but she also has a grandson named Francis who goes to their house at Christmas. He's dropped off by his parents there at Christmas. And so Scout and Jem and Jack and Atticus all spend Christmas often with Aunt Alexandra, and because Francis is left there, he's a character that kind of plays a part in the book as well. Living in the Finch house is Calpurnia, who is the nanny slash maid, housekeeper. She's African American, although the Finches are Caucasian. Important to remember because it is during segregation in the South, and so Calpurnia would come into town in the white part of town and work in the Finch household. She has a son named Zebo who shows up a little bit later in the novel, who is the garbage collector of the town and also leads singing at their church. So that's the Finch household, at least the Finch family. Aunt Alexandra does come to live with them at some part during the novel. Now you have the immediate neighborhood, which would be Caucasians because it's a white neighborhood. You have Miss Rachel, who lives next door, and she's important because another main child character named Charles Baker Harris, who goes by Dill, visits there every summer, and he stays with Aunt Rachel, and that's how he becomes friends with Scout and Jem. You have Miss Maudie, who lives across the street. She's an older woman who's very kind to the kids. Mr. Avery is kind of a grumpy older man that lives across the street as well. Miss Stephanie is the town gossip. She lives on their street, and she always is happy to supply the latest rumors and news to the kids. She's a big talker. Then you have Ms. DeBose, who lives at the end of the street and is between the Finch's house and town. They can't go to town without passing in front of her house. She's very old. She's mean, caustic. She talks trash to the kids whenever they go by. She sits on her front porch in a wheelchair. Then you have a servant. Her African-American servant's name is Jessie, and she takes care of her because Ms. DeBose is quite old and frail and sickly. Then on the other end of the street, blocking, on the way to school, is the Radley home. And at first in the actual book, there's a Mr. and Mrs. Radley. Both of them end up passing away during the course of the novel. There is an older brother named Nathan. He's, in his 50s. He's older. And then they have a younger brother named Arthur, and he is another kind of lurking character in the book named Boo. Everyone calls him Boo Radley because he's kind of a scary hermit-like figure, and no one really knows much about him. No one's ever seen him. And so he's kind of an important figure throughout the novel, even though we never see him in most of the book. So that's all of the neighbors in town that are kind of important. You do have some townspeople that play a key role. You have some teachers that show up throughout. Again, it would be a segregated school, so the teachers at the white school are also white. You have Miss Carolyn, who's Scout's first teacher. You have Mrs. Gates, who's Jem's teacher and later becomes Scout's teacher. You have a lawyer that comes into play named Mr. Gilmer. He becomes an important lawyer for a prosecution. You have the sheriff, whose name is Heck Tate. There's a paper writer, an editor of the local town paper named Mr. Larry Underwood. The judge in the town is named Judge Taylor. He's also an older man. You have a character named Link Diaz, who is an employer of kind of an important figure in the book, Tom Robinson, and he later on hires his wife and helps his wife out, and we'll talk about them in a moment. And then you have the outside of town. Outside of town would be African Americans. The key ones would be Tom Robinson, who is a major character in the trial in the middle of the book. His wife, Helen. They have some kids. The church that Calpurnia goes to and the Robinsons would go to has a pastor named Reverend Sykes, who shows up in the book as well. He's African American, of course. And then there's one colorful character at the church named Lula, who confronts Calpurnia at one point for bringing the kids to the church. And then you have some outlying Caucasians that are important to the story. One is Mr. Cunningham, who's a country farmer who Atticus helps out with some of his legal problems. And then he has a son named Walter who is in first grade with Scout, and he shows up a couple times in the book as well. And then you have the Ewell family. You have the father named Bob, who has a pretty bad reputation in town as an alcoholic who doesn't take very good care of his children. He lives right outside the dump. His oldest child is Mayella. She becomes an important character because Mayella is one of the accusers of the Robinsons, Tom Robinson, in the trial. And then she has younger brothers, like 6 or 7 of them, younger siblings, one of which is Burris Ewell, who shows up in Scout's class with her. So that's most of the characters in the book that you're going to encounter, and a brief description of them so that you can, kind of know who you're dealing with as you jump into this book and start to read it. So hopefully that was helpful and gave you some information.